Hi everyone, it's Clever Zodiembo here, and today I'll be answering a few questions from my previous video titled Malibu Joe, a portrait. Of course, to understand the context of what I'll be talking about here, it would help to first watch that video, so I'm gonna link it in the description. In any case, here's the first question. Is your first layer oil or acrylic paint? So that depends on what you're referring to when you ask about the first layer. The canvas as it comes in raw form doesn't have any paint on it, obviously. So the first layer, if I were to be very pedantic about it, is of course the primer, which is normally silk vinyl. And on top of that layer, at least in my style, the next one is usually an acrylic layer. So that's normally the flat gray or brown or whichever color surface that you normally see at the beginning of these painting videos, at least in the later ones. And if I use another painting on top of it, then that's also normally an acrylic layer. I've done oil underpaintings in the past, but I don't do that anymore because it's mostly unnecessary since I cover the oil paint completely anyway. And also oil paints take a long time to dry, which means I normally have to take long breaks between the underpainting and the final layers if I use an oil underpainting. But with acrylics, I can finish the underpainting and start the oil painting right away. So that layer is also an acrylic layer. Then of course now what will make the painting an oil painting is the subsequent layers, which are normally done completely in oils. And so the first few layers are silk vinyl and acrylic. Then after that is when the oil layers finally come into play. The next question goes, how many days do you typically wait between the first oil layer and the second detailed layer? After I've painted my acrylic underpainting and it's time to go on to the oil paints, there are various different ways in which I can do that. So I typically tend to switch this from painting to painting depending on what's appropriate for a particular piece. There's no common approach for all of them. But typically after the first layer, I normally have to wait maybe a day and a half or 2 days to be able to begin with the more detailed layer. The reason why it takes only 2 days, even though oil paints normally take maybe 4 or 5 days to fully dry, is because in the first oil layer, especially if I'm using something called a translucent layer, or at least that's how I call it, I use colors that are not too bright. From my experience, I found that white oil paint dries slower than any other color. And so for that first layer, I try to avoid using pure white just so that the colors can dry faster. And so I'm able to move on to the detailed layers more quickly. So that's normally 1.5 or 2 days or 3 days at most, depending on how bright some areas go. But I tend to avoid having to make myself wait for that long. The final question for today goes, do you use the solvent with oil paint or acrylic paint? Or can you use the solvent with both oil and acrylic paint? So for this, it will probably help to first explain what a solvent is. In painting, a solvent is what you'll use to thin the paint or to make it appear more translucent or to become more viscous. Sometimes if you apply a type of paint on canvas, be it oil, acrylic, watercolor, poster paints, whatever it is, the colors that appear on canvas or on paper, whichever surface you're using, may appear too opaque for you, and so may either make it difficult for you to see the layer underneath if that's what you're trying to do. And so if you mix that kind of paint with whatever solvent is appropriate for it, it will enable you to paint thinner layers. Another use of solvent is to clean your brushes when you're painting. And one more use is to remove the globs or the clumps of paint that may form when you're either mixing paint on your palette or when you're painting on your surface. So to answer the first question, I use solvents for oil paints more than I do for acrylic paints. This is because I need the acrylic paints to be opaque at all times when I apply them on the canvas. In my process, I use acrylics only for underpaintings. And for underpaintings, I don't need to blend anything or to be accurate with any textures or any smooth transitions between colors. And so for that reason, I don't use any solvent in acrylics. Also with acrylics, the solvent that's normally used is water. And when you mix acrylic with water, sometimes you can actually have water, or in this case, colored water, actually dripping from the canvas, which is something I don't ever want. With oil paints, however, I use solvents a lot. And this is because, especially if I'm painting with something that I normally call a translucent layer, I like to be able to see the underpainting underneath. And so for that reason, I love to mix the paint with just a bit of solvent. Another time I tend to use the solvent is when I'm painting the oil outlines, which is normally in the first part of my process. And so mixing the paint with some solvent allows me to paint these lines as easily as you see me do. The second question goes, can you use the solvent? I think she means, can you use the same solvent for both oil and acrylic paints? No, you cannot, because even though these paints can have similar pigments, they're manufactured differently. So within the oil paint itself, there's normally a medium called linseed oil. And linseed oil is what differentiates the oil from the acrylic, because acrylic paints are not mixed with that particular medium. Now, you may remember, oil doesn't mix with water. This is because its compounds are non-polar, whereas water is a polar solvent. Non-polar substances do not dissolve in polar substances and vice versa. What this means is at the molecular level, the compounds of oil do not have a negative and a positive pole. They also don't have a negative or a positive charge. And so this makes it impossible for them to successfully interact with the dipoles in the water molecule. And this is why if you mix kerosene and water in a container, kerosene will rise above and form pools of itself. Because being nonpolar, it's completely immiscible with the polar solvent, which is water in this case. For the same reason, you cannot use a polar substance, in this case water, as a solvent for a non-polar substance, in this case oil paints. And the inverse is also true in that you can't use, say, oil painting solvents like Gemsol, kerosene, tapenoid, or white spirits as a solvents for acrylic paints, which typically come bonded with water, which itself is a polar solvent. And so acrylic solvents are completely different from oil solvents, even though sometimes the final results on canvas can look similar depending on how good a particular artist is with a particular medium. The parts that get the artwork there can be different, and so it helps to know what mediums or solvents are appropriate for particular types of paint. So those are the 3 questions I'm going to answer in this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.